in this summit, clearly we're exploring expanded states of consciousness and the myriad ways that human beings have been accessing them for millennia and for realizing their potential for healing, for deep healing, and for transformation, spiritual evolution. And in this year's summit, we have a particular through line of focus on trauma, their potential for both for healing trauma and supporting post-traumatic growth. And so your work integrating very seamlessly internal family systems and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy seems to really contextualize and leverage expanded states in some unique ways. So I wondered if just maybe we could start with what does the term expanded states of consciousness mean for you, and how do you relate with it in your work?
I love that you asked, what does it mean? Because I think we really need to define what that means to us because it can be different for different people. I think we're in expanded and narrow states of consciousness all the time. I don't think it's like we're in a normal state of consciousness and then sometimes we go into expanded states of consciousness. Our brains are really amazing. I'm thinking about the quote by Aldous Huxley in Doors of Perception, that our brains are these incredible reducing valves. So when you think about that idea, that implies that there are all kinds of other realities out there, and that our human form distills information that's coming into our five senses in a very reductive way in order for us to survive. I think we're trying to save calories, we're trying to save energy by going into looping thoughts and regular, like normal ruminative thoughts so that we can survive, looking at patterns, things like that. So when you think about consciousness, what is consciousness? My consciousness is very different than a bat's consciousness. They see their world or experience their world through echolocation, right? So what even is a regular state of consciousness? I don't know. So I think that that's something to think about first, is what does that mean? So there's also this idea too of reality as something out there to be discovered. Like Aldous Huxley kind of, that kind of seems to point to there are these realities out there and we're reducing what we're perceiving. And then a materialist would say, everything's confined in our skull. We're just creating the world through thoughts and neuronal firings. I think it's that we're discovering the world. I don't think we're inventing the world. So that said, when I use things like internal family systems or EMDR or archetypal psychology or psychedelics, what I feel like we're doing is opening the aperture of consciousness to be able to access different slices of reality. So for example, using internal family systems, if we're working on a part that's a 12-year-old part where, his father was yelling at him, and that's this part that gets hijacked in his system, and we're working with that part, and he's talking to this 12-year-old, I don't think he's just fantasizing about this. I think he's in an expanded state of consciousness, and he's actually in some slice of reality where that 12-year-old boy is looping in some time loop somewhere. So we're accessing this all the time. When we're using internal family systems with the help of psychedelics, the psychedelic is potentiating and amplifying that ability to open our states of consciousness to access these deeper memories, these other realities, if that makes sense. So I kind of think I want to couch it into that kind of framework of understanding that we're actually discovering something, we're not inventing something.
Well, that's a really interesting view of internal family systems, and I've done a lot of psychodrama work in the past, and as a trainer, and a lot of chair work, and I know that in part discovered they didn't need the chairs anymore, but he was kind of doing that chair work. You have people sit in one chair and they're playing one part of it, then they move the other chair and they have dialogues back and forth. So I've done a lot of that work, and it's amazing when somebody drops into a part. It really does feel quite real. Almost seems like they're channeling something at sometimes, right? And so it does kind of make sense the way you talked about it. And you talked about what's my consciousness, what's a bat's consciousness, and it does make a lot of sense that what we're perceiving. I mean, even what we know from a lot of different scientific fields today, that really the brain is a reduction valve, and we are experiencing this very reduced version of reality that we can actually handle and do something with. But even the idea of my consciousness might be it may be there's my version of consciousness, there's a bat's version of consciousness, but it's interesting whether consciousness and reality are two separate things to begin with.
Right. Yeah, it is so interesting. And I think that Dick Schwartz would agree with me that we're actually going to some slice of reality and it's not a fantasy. When you talk about IFS and you get lost in the process and someone's starting to think about what that 12-year-old boy would say, you say, don't think, just ask him. He'll tell you. And inevitably, there's this interesting thing that happens where that part lives there and tells you what's going on. It's really fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, that almost gives a little credence to, Dick talks about these parts as if they're like entities, and we're actually born already with a multiplicity of parts. And I certainly can see the technology and how useful it is. That's been a little bit of a step further far for me to see them as actual entities. But when you start thinking about space and time and consciousness, and it is perhaps a lot bigger game than we're aware of.
It's wild, with psychedelic experiences and having kind of these magical, amazing things happen. You could say, oh, all of these experiences that you're having, these hallucinations that you're having in psychedelic experiences, just this fantastic way that your mind's creating this, and you could say that. But then these crazy things happen. A couple of years ago, I had this group come to a group experience, a ketamine experience. And this woman had privately shared with me that she was grieving her dog that was this beautiful white Samoyed dog. Is that how you say Samoyed? The white fluffy
I think so. Yeah.
Named Happy. This was his dog named Happy. She's so grieving. And she's very shy. So she comes to this retreat, doesn't know anyone else there. There are 8 other people there. They all show up and kind of process. And she didn't really share what she was processing about the grief of her dog. We have this journey. She comes out of her journey and she calls me over and she whispers to me, I'm so sad. Happy didn't show up in my journey. So I comfort her. We go back, we start doing the group process. This woman across the room who knew nothing about her said, I had the weirdest experience. I was flying around the universe. I was going through, nebulas and stars and the galaxy. And here's this white fluffy dog. And he's so happy and he's jumping up on me and he won't let me go. And he's flying around the universe with me. And I cannot figure out why I have this dog with me. And that was her journey. And it was just this weird thing where, what is the chance of that specific thing happening in that group? So I've always been kind of a skeptic, but when things like that happen, it gives me pause. What are we accessing here in these expanded states of consciousness? What are we going somewhere? Are these entities out in the field somewhere and we're able to contact them? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's really fun to wonder about it.